Hello class, this is the intro to macroeconomics YouTube video to go with chapter 7/chapter 6 in your text. Usually each lecture will be its own chapter or multiple lectures on a chapter, and each lecture kind of starts with a Roman numeral 1. I combine chapter 7 and chapter 6. We'll have multiple videos on chapter 7 and chapter 6, but it's all kind of one composite lecture, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a little bit. So we're going to start with a basic intro into macroeconomics, but before we can really talk about the basics of macro, an introduction to macro, we need to talk about economics in general. So the first thing we're going to do is a little brief history of economics and the economic thought and where it comes from. And I have a little PowerPoint presentation I'm going to give you on that topic. I don't use PowerPoint a lot in this class, but I think it's effective for this first introduction to the history of economics. So those of you that have had me for Principles of Micro have seen this PowerPoint before, but for those of you that haven't, we're going to talk a little bit about where economic thought itself comes from. So a good way to start is to just talk about the word itself, where the word comes from. We're going to look at the word origins of the word economy. And like lots of words that we use in English, lots of our English words are either based on Latin or Greek. The word economy or economics comes from Greece. Okay, it has a Greek origin. It's derived from the Greek word oikos, which means family and or household, but not just the members of your family, but anything you would own. Okay. Of course, at the time they owned slaves. It could include your farmland, any property, your house, members of your household. That's the word eco is derived from that word oikos. And nomi is also derived from the Greek nomos, which means management or law. So we're talking about the management of your household and your things. That's the original meaning of the word oikonomos, which is where we get the word economy. And actually the first economic textbook, if you want to think of it that way, was Oikonomika, written by Aristotle. This isn't an original copy, but here's a Greek version of Aristotle's Oikonomika. It had multiple parts. The first part was a treatise on household management, as we discussed. The second part was a longer discussion on governmental finance. So in some sense, here's your first microeconomics at the household level, and then macroeconomics at the larger macro level, which would include the government or federal government. And the third, which only exists in two medieval Latin translations, was a manual for marital happiness. So the happy wife, happy life, I guess, approach. So again, the word oikonomika is based on the word oikos, which means household, and nomi, the management thereof. Well, who founded the study of economics? Well, not this guy. That is Joseph Schumpeter. He was born in Austria, but he lived and worked in the United States. He was a professor at Harvard University. A very accomplished economist in his own right. He popularized the term creative destruction, which you'll still hear talked about in economics, this idea that as an economy advances, new jobs, new production will come online, and as such, old ways of doing things tend to be destroyed. So, the locomotive really destroyed a lot of the blacksmith's trade, as it limited the need for the use of horses as transportation, and the automobile in many ways destroyed some of the jobs in the transportation jobs related to locomotives. So this was kind of his area of study. But towards the end of his life and career, he wrote a book called The History of Economic Analysis. It was published after his death, and it is considered really the work on the history of economics, where economics comes from. And Joseph Schumpeter wrote that the late scholastics come nearer than does any other group to having been the founders of scientific economics. The late scholastics. Well, who were the late scholastics? Well, before we can talk about the late scholastics, we need to talk about the early scholastics, which of course were just referred to as the scholastics. Scholastic is where we get the term scholar from. You will all hope to be, scholars. Some of you won scholarships. You're going to engage in scholarly activities while you're at the university. So again, this is kind of where the founding of universities, as we know them today anyway, comes from, the scholastic method. It's an approach to study. So here's the first scholastic, if you will. That is Saint Dominic. He was the founder of the Dominican order, and the reason why he's considered, or the Dominican order was considered this first scholastic order, is because Saint Dominic really wanted to emphasize the use of reason in propagating and defending Christian doctrine. Okay, and a lot of the Aristotelian sources were available at this time, and so he relied a lot on reason, in addition to revelation, scripture, to win converts. And one of his first or early students, not him directly, but the Dominican order, they weren't quite contemporaries, was this man right here, Saint Albert, or as he's known in Latin, Albertus Magnus, or Albert the Great. And he wrote, his great work was considered Physica. And Physica was basically an all-in-one textbook. He wanted to make intelligible to all the Latins, meaning the Latin-speaking world, meaning Christendom, all the branches of natural science, logic, rhetoric, mathematics, astronomy, ethics, economics, politics, metaphysics. Again, this is kind of an all-in-one textbook. And here's where we start to get kind of this university system. Here's St. Albert giving a lecture. That might just be a scholastic. I can't remember my source of the artwork here, but this is the bigger mural here has students kind of taking notes like you should be. And St. Albert, this next person was a student of St. Albert, was St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican priest, one of the most important medieval philosophers and theologians. He's probably the greatest philosopher of all time. Although he wrote, and he's called the Angelic Doctor. You can see here in this popular painting of St. Thomas, the Holy Ghost whispering in his ear, okay? He was referred to as the Angelic Doctor. And he wrote many works on philosophy, theology throughout his life. His most influential work was the Summa Theologica, which translates a summary of theology, but it consisted of 3 parts. The first part was on God. The second part was on ethics. And ethics is, how do we morally treat each other? And as part of his ethical discussion on ethics, there's a large portion dedicated to ethics and exchange, right? When two people engage in some type of contract and agree to some type of exchange. And here's where we see the roots of economics. He even talks about prices and in the just setting of prices, and what information needs to be conveyed by the buyer and what information needs to be conveyed by the seller. He talks about interest rates and loan contracts. So again, here's where we see the seeds of what we would call modern economics. There's a picture of the Summa, although it's called the summary. It's quite a voluminous work. And St. Thomas gives us the definition of truth that we still use today. It's to me the best definition of truth. So there it is in Latin. My Latin's not too good, but veritas logica est adequatio intellectus et re, which translates, the logical truth is the equation of thought with thing. Okay, you see this veritas, truth, right? For Christ and Church. Okay, this is the insignia of Harvard University. They've actually removed this. This is an old insignia, but they again likely would, at times in the past, this would be the really only acceptable definition of truth. Logical truth is the equation of thought with thing. So the maybe the modern vernacular version is, you've probably all heard the saying, it is what it is. Okay, and that's a good kind of modern translation of this. A thing is what it is. It's not what you think it is what it is. Just as an example, this is a chair, okay? It has the constituent parts of a chair. It's got legs to hold it up. It's got a place for you to be seated. There can be additional things that aren't necessary, but don't change the fact that it's a chair. This one has a back support. It's pretty, got some detailed woodwork. It has a cushion. It wouldn't have to have that, but it has the constituent parts, okay? It's got legs to keep it up, or some type of way to keep it up. It's got a place for you to sit. This is a chair. Now, if you identify this as a potted plant, you are wrong. It is not a potted plant. You have not equated your thought with the thing, okay? Your thought is this is a potted plant. It is not. It is a chair. So you have not arrived at the logical truth. You will arrive at logical truth when you equate your thought with the thing. Your thought has to conform with the way things are. This is a potted plant, okay? These two things are not the same thing. All right, so it doesn't matter if you identify this as a potted plant. It is not a potted plant, and you have not arrived at the truth until you can get your mind to equate your thinking with what this thing is, a chair. Okay, and that's the truth that we're looking for in economics, logical truth. We want to understand how things are. Some people would define, I think, truth the other way around, equating thing with your thought. So in other words, I think this is a potted plant, so it is a potted plant. Sorry, you're incorrect. The entire world of science would collapse if that was our definition of truth. Okay, well then that kind of covers the scholastics. Who were the late scholastics? So in the 16th, 17th century, it was kind of a revival of the scholastic method. Okay, here's another type of picture of the scholastic method. You got people down here taking notes. Okay, these were mostly going to be clerics and religious, but this is what's going on here. So the scientific culture of the second scholasticism surpassed its medieval source of scholasticism, the early scholastics, in the number of proponents, the breadth, the scope, the complexity. Here's where we see kind of the modern scientific method developing. And here's a book entitled Faith and Liberty, The Economic Thought of the Late Scholastics by Alejandro Chofan. This is an interesting discussion of this very topic if you're interested. Now, of the late scholastics, so there were, all of the major universities in Europe were, scholastic universities, and they were usually attached to a cathedral church like the University of Paris or something like that. But and oftentimes they developed certain areas of thought where they were kind of the maybe seen as the expertise even worldwide. And the School of Salamanca in Spain was really where we see this advancing of the discipline of economics, the modern scientific discipline of economics. Murray Rothbard, a famous economist of the Austrian school, referred to them as the Proto-Austrians, the first Austrians. So again, it's not just Joseph Schumpeter that sees the origins of economics in these late scholastics. So our modern economic thought, a lot of the things that you would have discussed in, say, Eco 230, like specialization and we often attribute to Adam Smith, or supply and demand models, which we often attribute to Alfred Marshall, or comparative advantage, David Ricardo, opportunity cost, Friedrich von Weiser. All of these things can be found at least in some form in the late scholastic writings, and even sometimes in the scholastic writings. And the same is true of our macroeconomics. So we're going to talk about kind of schools of macroeconomic thought. Adam Smith is seen as kind of the founder of the classical school. John Maynard Keynes of the Keynesian school. Friedrich Hayek as the Austrian school, maybe not a founder, but a proponent. Milton Friedman of kind of the monetarist school. And we'll talk about all these schools, a little less of the Austrian, but some, in terms of a critique of Keynesianism. But we'll talk about these schools of economic thought. And again, they all have roots in the late scholastic period. A lot of writings even at the School of Salamanca, and even in seed form in the early scholastics. So again, that's kind of where economics as a discipline has come from. It's a growth out of kind of a study of ethics that we saw in the early church, and as things expanded in the economy, a more specialized discipline was needed, and that was started to be addressed by the late scholastics and continues today. So now that we've covered this brief history of economics, let's now talk about economic history of the United States. And that'll lead us into our more in-depth discussion of macroeconomics. Okay, so we're going to start in 1776, and you might think, well, why are we starting there? And a lot of you may come to the conclusion that that's the founding of our country. And that is certainly true. And that's a good place to start the economic history of the United States. But it also was the date of the publishing of The Wealth of Nations. By Adam Smith. We talked briefly about Adam Smith and the PowerPoint. And this work, and again, it's actually got a longer title. It's an inquiry into the causes of the wealth of nations, something along those lines. I should have had that with me, but this is certainly a work that would have been familiar to the founders, this work of Adam Smith. Certainly at the forming of our Constitution, which wasn't until later on. The Wealth of Nations kind of is the start of what we would call the classical school of economics, okay? And we see, or we hear this term, laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire economics would be kind of a government hands-off approach to let things work themselves out, what Adam Smith referred to as the invisible hand. Okay, the invisible hand. Those of you that have had 230, we talked about within a marketplace, there will be the supply and the demand for a product, and this supply and demand will move prices to an equilibrium price. There's one price that'll clear the market. Any price above that will create a surplus. Any price below that will create a shortage. So the market will, by itself, move to clear the market, have quantity demanded equal to quantity supplied at a given price. And this was kind of discussed, not in the detail with supply and demand curves, but by Adam Smith. And it was kind of the approach that we took largely in the United States to macroeconomics. That is to say, the government should have its hands off. You see this even in the Constitution, where it says explicitly anything not delegated to the federal government is the purview of the states. So actually, a strict reading of the Constitution would give the federal government very limited power to control the economy. Now, that may not be what we're doing today, but it's certainly a strict reading of the Constitution would suggest that the federal government has very limited ability to control the macroeconomy. Okay, and this was probably the guiding principle for this laissez-faire, this invisible hand approach to the U.S. economy from its founding, largely. Again, this is kind of a Reader's Digest version, but largely, meaning to say, a not very detailed. There's lots of incidents in economic history that have occurred between here and here, and we'll talk about some of them over the course of the semester. But largely, this was the dominant approach until the 1930s. Okay? And in the 1930s, as you should recall from history, we experienced what was called the Great Depression. Okay? The Great Depression. And this coincided with the writings of another economist. Okay? So again, we're going to talk about the classical school as being affiliated with Adam Smith. Well, we're going to talk about the Keynesian school at one point. And its founder was John Maynard Keynes. Okay? John Maynard Keynes. Okay? And John Maynard Keynes is an important figure in economic thought, specifically because he really moved away from this paradigm of government hands off, of laissez-faire. He really believed that the invisible hand did not work, and believed that the government should prime the pump. Anyone mowing their lawns right now, right? You get that little red button on the side of your mower. You're priming it, okay? You're priming the engine, right? You're getting some gasoline there, help it get started. And Keynes believed that the government shouldn't get involved, specifically with fiscal policy. So here's where we see the advent of fiscal policy, where you're using government taxes and spending specifically to move the macroeconomy. Okay? Obviously, Adam Smith would have agreed with some level of taxation, perhaps, in government spending. Our founders certainly saw a role for the federal government to pay for national defense. But again, it wasn't to manage the macroeconomy. Keynes, in his work on money and interest, believed that the government should be ready at a point where the invisible hand's not working, and get things started by taxing and spending in the economy. this was the dominant thought until the 1960s into the 70s. So we went from, you could maybe think of one extreme of no government intervention to a view, and most economists would have fallen into this camp, until the 1930s. There was kind of this revolution where Keynesian economics really took over, and it dominated until the 1970s. Well, what happened in the 1970s? Well, in the 1970s, we experienced what was called stagflation. And stagflation was something that John Maynard Keynes basically told us really couldn't happen. He thought there was always going to be a trade-off between inflation, when prices are going up, and unemployment. So Keynes believed that in periods where you had high unemployment, you would have low inflation, and in periods where you had high inflation, you would have low unemployment. I believe there was always this trade-off. Well, in the 1970s, we had double-digit inflation. Okay, right now it's about 2%. Okay, and we had double-digit inflation, and we had double-digit unemployment, which we actually are experiencing double-digit unemployment right now. But double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment. Okay, so that was not supposed to happen according to Keynes, and we also kind of saw the advent of the computer, so we could test models with real data. And what we saw was Keynes, who proposed a lot of theories, but we really couldn't test the theories, and really they shouldn't even be called theories, they were more hypotheses because we couldn't test them. His hypotheses really couldn't be tested until later. Now, when we saw stagflation, we said, hey, this shouldn't happen according to his hypothesis. Well, maybe we should start to test this. And we had enough real data. We started collecting a lot of data in the 1930s, and now we can start to test things. And what we saw was a lot of what Keynes purported to be true was not true. It wasn't what is. And so we had to equate our thought with thing. We had to get our minds to rethink things and have it correspond with reality. And we'll talk more about this period later. One of the people that comes out of this time period is Milton Friedman. And a Nobel Prize winner in economics, and really the founder of what we'd call the monetarist school, where there was a significant critique of Keynes, and in some ways a return to classical thought, although not completely. And he talked about the monetarist, sounds like a funny name, but you can almost see the word money in there. M-O-N-E, just add the Y, okay? They discussed a lot about money, and here's where we're going to see a lot of discussion of monetary policy. So a lot of discussion of fiscal policy here, a lot of discussion of monetary policy here, and before that, it was more of a self-regulated economy. And we'll talk about all of these over the course of the semester, okay? I just want to mention briefly more recently, okay? In 2008, we experienced a Great Recession, and we saw a huge uptick in fiscal policy and some monetary policy that we had never seen before. And the data is starting to come in, so we're going to be able to do a lot of testing about the effectiveness of these it's currently going on. And in course in 2020 we had the shutdown. I'm not sure what it'll end up being called in history, but we shut down the economy in large parts of the country. We saw the biggest drop in GDP since the Great Depression in the second quarter of 2020. And again, we've seen some interesting uses of fiscal policy and monetary policy. and it'll be a while before we can judge the effectiveness of these. So again, that's just to give you a brief history of brief economic history in the United States, and it's going to be a good history to kind of maybe look back at once in a while, just to see how this macro stuff we're going to talk about fits together. So we'll start with a self-regulated economy. We'll talk about potential uses for fiscal policy, taxes, and government spending, including the controversy surrounding that. This is certainly not everyone would advocate that, and even those that might would not advocate it in certain situations. And then we'll talk about monetary policy, okay? Changing the money supply, which in effect changes interest rates, and we'll talk about how that's been used, how economists view monetary policy, and again, there's controversy there. When should we use monetary policy, if at all? And even if we could use it to help, when would it be appropriate? And what types of things should we do? So that's kind of a jumping off point for this class. So the last thing we're going to cover on this video, in this introduction, is our three major macroeconomic goals. So as we study macroeconomics and we talk about policies, and we're going to make comparisons. Is this policy a good policy in this situation? Is that policy a good policy in this situation? Should we step out of the way in terms of policy? Well, we need to have some goals in mind, right? You don't want to initiate some type of plan to improve things unless you know what you want to improve to. What exactly are our goals? Okay. So we're going to kind of talk about the three major macroeconomic goals that we have for the economy, that most economists would have for the economy. The first goal, and the most important, okay, this is the most important goal, is high, sustainable economic growth. Okay? High sustainable economic growth, okay? And we're going to talk about this in a little bit of detail here, okay? Well, first of all, let's take the word economic growth, okay? What do we mean by that? So growth in what? Growth in what? Well, the answer is the production of goods and services. If you remember from micro, and again, when I say if you remember from micro, that doesn't mean you have to have had it. It's a way of saying those of you that have had it, recall this, and those of you that hadn't, make note of it. But our major problem in microeconomics that we were working to solve was we have unlimited wants, but we have limited resources to produce for those wants, okay? And that's not a microeconomics problem. It's just a human condition problem, okay? And so as economists, we're going to make an assumption that we want to increase what we can produce to meet more wants, okay? Wants and needs. So by producing more goods and services, we can produce for more wants and needs. Now, again, that may not always be the case, and producing more cars doesn't necessarily make us better off per se. But again, we're probably making those cars, right? A producer wants to make cars that they think people will buy, and if they're making it because they think people will buy it, there's probably a want or need there that's being met. Okay, so we want to see a growth in the production of goods and services. This is the most important goal. I mean, think about the changes that we've seen in the last 100 years, okay? Or even just say my lifetime, okay? So I'm not quite 100 years old, okay? But when I was a kid, the TV had been invented. but we got 3 channels. Okay, there was no such thing as cable TV. There was no such thing as even a VCR, as antiquated as those are. If you wanted to see a movie, you went to the movie theater, and when it left the movie theater, it was done. I remember Disney used to re-release their movies every decade or so. So when I wanted to see, a Disney classic like, you know, Snow White, okay, and the Seven Dwarfs, I had to wait for it to come to the movie theater, okay. I had a phone, but we had one for the family, and it was attached to the wall. We didn't have central air conditioning, although I think it had been invented, but it wasn't as promulgated as it is now. Cars didn't have air conditions in them. So what's happened over time? In that time period, things have changed to meet the wants of individuals, right? So you want a phone, but you want your phone to be able to travel with you in your pocket, and you want it to be able to take pictures and video and search the internet. Okay, that's a huge change in a relatively short period of time. Okay, so again, we want to see this growth in the production of goods and services. It's going to help us meet more of the wants that people have, and we want it to be as high as possible. Okay, so the more growth, the better, properly understood. Now, when we say sustainable, we don't mean it in some green, environmental way. Okay, sustainable has kind of taken on a new meaning. When economists have always said we want high sustainable growth, all we mean by that is we don't want any phony growth that is kind of a sugar high that's going to hurt us later, right? So we could maybe overutilize all of our resources to produce more this year, but then there'd be no available resources for next year, right? So we could harvest all the fish out of the ocean and have a significant fish harvest this year, but then there wouldn't be any fish to reproduce, and we wouldn't have any next year. We could extract all of the coal that we have in every seam, and burn it this year, but in wasteful ways maybe, but we want to use it over time. Okay, so that's all we mean by sustainable. And again, this is the most important goal, and this is the tools that we're going to need. We're going to need tools. Okay, so we need to measure. Okay, we need to measure. I mean, it's not good to set any goals unless there's something you can measure. So if you're setting goals this semester for yourself of, I want to be a good student, well, that's all well and good, but you're probably going to change your, where the finish line is, or the goal line. You probably need a more specific goal, like I want a certain GPA, or I want to get only all A's in my major, or whatever it is. Okay, so we're going to need some tools to measure this, and we're gonna gain a lot of those tools in Chapter 7. So because this is the most important goal, we're going to cover Chapter 7 first. Okay, the other 2 goals are in no particular order. I'm just going to cover them in the order that we're going to cover them in class. And one is price stability. Okay, and we might ask, the price of what? Well, it's really the price of everything. The overall prices of all goods and services. So another way of saying that is the average level of all prices. Okay, and when we talk about the average level of all prices, when the average level of prices go up, that's what we call inflation. If the average level of all prices went down, we would call that deflation. Which, by the way, unanticipated inflation or deflation are both bad for the economy. We'll talk about that more later. It's incorrect to say, like if you go to the grocery store and you see the price of milk has gone up, it's not correct to say, man, inflation's killing me. The price of milk has gone up. That could be because, a bunch of dairy cows died and the supply has decreased. Or, a tornado swept through Wisconsin and wiped out a bunch of dairy farms or whatever, okay? Inflation is a general increase in the average level of all prices. Deflation is a general decrease in the average level of all prices, okay? And the last one, okay, and we're going to measure this. We need tools, okay? We need some tools, and we're going to get these tools in Chapter 6, okay? And the last goal, I can't really give you yet because we don't really have the vocabulary. So I'm going to put it in quotes. We're going to come back and fix this later. I'm going to put low unemployment. But that is not really correct, okay? But I should probably say not 0% unemployment. Why not? Well, that would cause some problems, and we'll talk about what those are later. There's some types of unemployment we're really not concerned about. That might sound shocking, but it'll make more sense when we get to that portion of the class. Okay. And this is also covered in Chapter 6. We need some tools, and we're going to cover those tools in Chapter 6 as well. Okay. So the second and third goals we're going to talk about in Chapter 6, and the first and most important goal we're going to cover in Chapter 7, and that's why we cover Chapter 7 first. Okay? Now, we're going to need some understanding of what good numbers are and bad numbers are, and I'm going to hold you to those, okay? You might find those on quizzes and tests. And so I'm just going to give you some brief information on that right now, okay? When we look at growth, we're going to look at GDP growth, specifically real GDP growth, okay? And over the last recent history, okay, not including the shutdown, it's been at about 2%, okay? 2 to 4, I should say 2 to 4%, okay? 2 to 4% growth in real GDP, and that means it's been corrected for inflation. Maybe I'll put that. Real GDP, 2 to 4% growth in say the last 50 years or so. In more recent times, more in the 2 to 3% range, but certainly lower during the Great Recession of 2008, and of course we had some really good growth from 2016 until this shutdown. Okay. And we'll be looking at those numbers as they come out. Price stability, we're going to talk about inflation. Inflation in recent history has been about 2%. Okay? About 2%. During the stagflation of the 1970s, we had double-digit inflation, 14, 15% inflation. In recent times, it's been around 2%. Okay? And that's actually the Fed target, 2%. Okay? So again, during stagflation, double-digit inflation, 14, 15%, but in more recent times, about 2%, and that is the Fed target. Low unemployment, we had record low unemployment from 2016 to right before the shutdown. We had about 3% unemployment, okay, in say 2019, okay. Last 30 years or so, it's probably been about 5 to 7% unemployment. Okay, we'll look at some numbers more specifically later, so this is kind of what we've worked off more recently, and of course those numbers were much higher in 2008, and the numbers are much higher now. We're just starting to collect those numbers. Oftentimes we get numbers, and they're old. I mean, that's kind of the nature of collecting data. So anyway, this has been our introduction to macroeconomics, okay? That goes along with chapters 6 and 7, kind of an introduction to those chapters. And the next lecture will cover chapter 7 in a lot more detail. And we'll be talking to you soon. God bless.